Hey, this is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we're going to pick up with unit number 12, and we're going to look at lesson number 7, the American Youth Movement or the Counterculture, a group that we affectionately call the hippies. Today what we'll do is we'll start with a unit focus question, and we have 4 unit focus questions. We will not address them at this particular point, but at the end of the unit, I promise you we'll get to them. Identify and describe Kennedy and Johnson's domestic and foreign policy goals, trials, and accomplishments. Identify the origin, major players, strategies, and accomplishments of the modern civil rights movement. Describe the impact of the Vietnam War had on American life and politics, and what impact did the civil rights movement have on other underserved and underrepresented groups in America. Well, we'll start with our vocabulary. As we always tell you, go ahead and take out your journals, write down these particular terms and define them yourself. And as they come up in the lesson, we'll address as many of them, of course, as we can. We will start, of course, with one lesson focus question for lesson number 7. It's to describe the evolution of the youth movement in America from beatniks to the hippies. Right, what we'll start, of course, with today is our journal topic. And this do now activity, of course, says students write down this question: what does the word counterculture or hippie mean to you? And make your response and be prepared to share. I bet you vast majority of you didn't know what counterculture was, but I bet you most of you knew what hippies were. And when you think of hippies, of course, in hippie culture, you think about long hair, drug use, free love, all those things, of course, that come to be associated with the movement. And it's also a movement, of course, of community of sorts. A lot of people looked at hippies and thought that they were, of course, rejecting American society, which they were. But it was also about trying to find a perfect, perfect life or perfect way of being in the environment. Today we're going to talk about where the counterculture, of course, emerges. It emerges from the 1950s. The 1950s youth in America patterned themselves after their parents, and they were disciplined and conformity-minded. They obeyed rules and followed the status quo. They were the carbons of their parents. And when we look at the 1950s, we're talking about those kids of the 50s. The vast majority of them, believed in the American dream. They were the kids, of course, that we see, of course, on television with like Richie Cunningham, of course, and Wally and Beaver Cleaver. They were carbons of their parents. And we've talked about that to some degree before. The beatniks would be the group that we see in the 1950s. They were the antithesis of conformity and status quo. Beatniks dressed differently, groomed differently, and rejected traditionalism. Beatniks would give way in the 1960s and 1970s to the hippies. And that's where we're going to start today, with the hippies. Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road, of course, was the voice of the beat generation. And we're going to find that because of Kerouac, because of the beatniks, that gives rise to the counterculture or the hippie movement. The SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, arose out of the New Left, which were baby boom kids in the 1960s. The purpose of the SDS was to reform American politics by freeing it from special interests and large corporate influence, ending poverty, and ending the Vietnam War. And it shouldn't shock you, of course, that the SDS becomes very, very popular, of course, on American college campus, particularly colleges like Berkeley or the University of California at Berkeley. This free speech movement started with students at the University of California at Berkeley campus. It fought to guarantee student right to free speech on campus. Its success would be set the stage for the campus protests throughout the 1960s and 1970s and beyond. And the topics, of course, of the day would be civil rights, it would be Native American rights, it would be Latino rights, women's rights, and then, of course, it will also be the Vietnam War. The hippies, well, who are they? The counterculture created the rise in dropouts of the traditional culture. The hippies who rejected society in favor of free love, communal living, drug use, and rock and roll music. So they were the dropouts. They rejected everything that, of course, that was conformity in the 1960s and early 1970s. The counterculture set the stage for more individuality in American culture, but as a movement was relatively short-lived, but its effect on fashion and music have endured even till today. Musicians like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and Jim Morrison helped provide the soundtrack to the counterculture. 3 of the 5 are members of the infamous 27 Club. And what the 27 Club, of course, were musicians or artists, of course, that died, that had a significant impact, that died by the age of 27. 3 of the 5 that we mentioned that were the soundtrack, of course, to the counterculture, Morrison, Brian Jones, and Jimi Hendrix, all of which, were the charter members of the 27 Club, and they'll be joined a little bit later with people like, Kurt Cobain and Amy Winehouse and Jean-Michel Basquiat. Here's some of the hippie symbols, of course. The peace sign, of course, on the right, and then psychedelic flowers, of course, on the left. Bright colors, tie-dye. Flower Children music. On the left, you have one of the members of the 27 Club, of course, Jim Morrison of The Doors. And then on the right, you have Jimi Hendrix, who a lot of people, of course, widely say is the greatest guitar player of all time. I don't know if I believe that, but he's pretty doggone good. And then on the left, you have Janis Joplin, who's also a charter member of the 27 Club. And on the right, you have Bob Dylan, and then Joan Baez. Here is the 27 Club members. On the far left, Brian Jones, of course, from the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, All Along the Watchtower. Okay. Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison from The Doors, Jean-Michel Basquiat, who is an artist that makes this particular group because of the impact that he has in the 1970s. And then you have Kurt Cobain from Nirvana and Amy Winehouse to round out the group. This is one of those clubs that if you're an artist or musician, you don't necessarily want to be a part of. 1968. 1968 was a great year for the history of the United States of America, not necessarily a great year for the country. We've talked a little bit about some of the things, of course, that happened in 68. And what we're going to do now is transition and show you a film from PBS Learning Media that details some of the events of 1968, and how the country, of course, navigated through that particular crisis time. So at this particular time, what we want you to do, of course, is to transition to this particular video in the lesson description. Click on it, view the film, and then once you've finished the film, complete the activities, convert it to a PDF, and turn it into your teacher to be graded. You should have had enough time that you were able, of course, to go through and look at 1968. And in looking at 1968, what you should have been able to do, of course, to see that it was a pretty tumultuous period in history of the United States of America. We look at the assassination of two very prominent figures, with Robert F. Kennedy, of course, being killed on the campaign trail, and then, of course, the death of Dr. King in Memphis, Tennessee. All right, we have lesson focus question. Describe the evolution of the youth movement in America from the beatniks to the hippies. And once again, we've talked about the beatniks at length, and we've talked, of course, a little bit about the hippies today. And what we can say about that is this: in the 1950s, students mirrored the images of their parents and conformed to societal norms. They were small carbons of their parents. There was a subsection of youth in the 1950s, however, that rejected the traditional norms, and those were the beatniks. The baby boom generation in the 1960s gave us youth that rejected being clones of their parents and instead opted for a flamboyant dress, bell bottoms, yeah, I remember those two, drugs, rock and roll, free love, and an end to racism and communal living. These baby boomers were given the moniker hippies. Well, hope you enjoyed a little bit of the information that we were able to present to you today. And that film, 1968, was a very powerful, learning tool. And we hope you, of course, were able to look at it and get some perspective about what 1968 was and how pivotal it was in the history of the United States of America, in the contemporary history of the United States of America. With that, please understand, as I always tell you, do your own research, draw your own conclusion. And with that, I'll see you next time.